Hi, my name is Kevin Crawford and I'm an admission counselor at UNLV. Today we're going to be reading Women in Science, 50 Fearless Pioneers Who Changed the World by Rachel Ignotofsky. Part of the reason I chose this book is because when I was in school, being somebody who is very interested in mathematics, many of the scientists and mathematicians we learned about were men, and it wasn't until we received this book that I learned about all of the great accomplishments that many women had. Today, although there are 50 in this book, we only have time to read about 4, so let's get started. Wang Zhenyi, astronomer, poet, and mathematician. Wang Zhenyi was one of the greatest scholars in China. She was born in 1768 during the Qing dynasty. At the time, China had a strict feudal system, and education was only available for the wealthy, and women were expected to cook, sew, and not be bothered by studies. Wang Jinyan was fortunate to be born into a family of scholars who valued her education. Her grandfather and father taught her astronomy and math. She also traveled extensively and saw how extreme taxation affected the less fortunate. Learning about the harshness of poverty inspired her to write poetry, decrying injustice. In Wang Zhenyi's day, eclipses were considered mysterious and beautiful, but were not well understood. But she had theories about how they worked, and she created her own eclipse model using a mirror, a lamp, a globe that she tied with ropes around a table. She used it to prove her theories about how the moon blocks our view of the sun, or the earth blocks the sun's light from reaching the moon during an eclipse. And there were planetary problems to solve. Wang Zhenyi scientifically studied the Chinese calendar system and used her telescope to measure the stars and further explain the rotation of the solar system. She was also a dedicated mathematician. Her struggles with math would often make her stop and sigh, but she pushed through those tough moments. She understood complicated arithmetic theories, and at the age of 24 published a 5-volume guide for beginners called Simple Principles of Calculation. This work, compiled 6 years after Wang Zhenyi's death, was prefaced by the famous scholar Qian Yiji and read by many. Wang Zhenyi lived only to age 29, but she is remembered as one of the greatest minds of the Qing dynasty. She published many volumes of writing on math, astronomy, and poetry, and her work influenced legions of scientists, mathematicians, and writers who came after her. Marjory Stoneman Douglas, writer and conservationist. In the late 1940s, Florida's Everglades were seen as a nuisance, just one big swamp that needed draining. The only thing that prevented the destruction of the wetlands was a feisty woman named Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Marjorie was born in 1890 in Minneapolis. She always wanted to be a writer, and after ending a bad marriage, she got a job at the Miami Herald, where her father also worked. She started her career as a society reporter in 1915. Her father used his status as editor of the newspaper to talk about politics and criticize the governor's plan to drain the Everglades. As a result, Marjorie understood how powerful words could be, and she began to use her own writing to talk about civil rights, the suffrage movement, and environmental conservation. Ernest Coe, a fellow conservationist, asked Marjorie to help save the Everglades. Although the land was no place for a picnic, too buggy, too wet, Marjorie fell in love with its natural beauty. She discovered that the Everglades was not just a swamp, but a river that is vital to Florida's ecosystem. She published The Everglades, River of Grass in 1947. The book and Marjorie became famous. Her work led directly to the creation of Everglades National Park. Although the government began to protect the Everglades, Marjorie needed to protect the land from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, whose agricultural dams and canals were disrupting the ecosystem. A proposed jetport project threatened its destruction. Marjorie's gumption and expert knowledge of the land ensured her a win. In 1969, she started the Friends of the Everglades organization and halted construction. Marjorie continued her work well into the 1990s. Despite being nearly blind, she continued to write and fight for the Everglades. Her energy and passion only increased, and she was awarded with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1993. She died at the age of 108 in 1998. Katherine Johnson, physicist and mathematician. Katherine Johnson was born in 1918 in West Virginia and always had a love of learning and math. She excelled in school and enrolled at West Virginia State College when she was only 15 years old. Katherine assumed she was going to become a math teacher or a nurse like other women she knew, until she got to college and met her professor, the famous mathematician W. W. Schieffelin Clater. He inspired Katherine to become a research mathematician and helped her pick out the classes she would need to achieve this goal. When she was 18, Katherine graduated college. It was the height of the Great Depression, and jobs were scarce, so she fell back on teaching high school. In the 1950s, NASA began to have more openings for African American female computers. Katherine applied and got a job. Katherine wanted to know the ins and outs of what she was working on. She was not allowed in meetings, so she asked if it was against the law for a woman to be in one. Her boldness and curiosity paid off, and she was included. Calculating flight paths involved complicated geometry equations, and Katherine was extremely good at these. She was pulled into working on the 1961 manned Mercury mission and successfully calculated the launch window. Her skill in mathematics was on point. She quickly became a leader in calculating trajectory, making her an essential part of the team that calculated the path for the first manned mission to the moon in 1969. She did most of the calculations on the project and was also in charge of checking the math on the brand new mechanical computers at NASA. The math had to be perfect if the Apollo team was to return to Earth safely. The Apollo mission was a success, and her crucial contributions made it possible. Katherine later worked on lots of important NASA projects, including the Space Shuttle program and plans for the mission to Mars. Her work has helped astronauts visit the stars and come safely back to Earth. She retired after 33 years of service in 1986. Jane Cooke Wright, oncologist. Jane Cooke Wright was born in 1919 into a family of famous doctors. Her grandfather was the first African American to graduate from Yale's medical school, and her father founded Harlem's Hospital Cancer Research Foundation. She and her father changed cancer treatment forever. In the 1940s, a cancer diagnosis was often considered a sure death sentence. Doctors were just starting to experiment with ways to attack cancer cells. They even tried injecting a form of mustard gas into patients. After Jane graduated from New York Medical College in 1945, she started her career in cancer research, working with her father at Harlem Hospital. After her father died, Jane became the head of cancer research at the center at the age of 33. Jane developed new techniques to approach cancer treatment that saved precious time. Instead of testing chemo drugs on the patient directly, Jane tested only samples of their cancer tissue. This allowed her to quickly create the most effective treatment. She understood that individual people and different types of cancer all needed to be factored into creating a unique cocktail of chemotherapy drugs. Jane also invented a new way to treat hard-to-reach tumors. As an alternative to surgically removing all tumors, which sometimes necessitated removing whole organs along with them, Jane developed a less invasive way to precisely deliver chemo to certain areas in the body using a catheter. In a time where there were few African American doctors and even fewer who were women, Jane became a leader in the field of oncology. She was an original co-founder of the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the Associate Dean of the New York Medical College. She was also the first woman president of the New York Cancer Society. Jane Wright was not only an excellent doctor, but also a trailblazer for women in medicine. Thank you all for taking the time to learn about 4 women in science. If you would like to learn about 46 others, I definitely recommend this book. And if you were really excited about Katherine Johnson, you can learn a lot more about her in the movie Hidden Figures, which is one of my favorites.